My boyfriend told me to smile more. He had no idea what he was in for. Hudson was always telling me I could be prettier if I tried harder. I'd been ignoring it for months, but at his friend's party, exhausted from a double shift, something finally snapped. He grabbed my face in front of everyone and said, "You'd be so much prettier if you smiled more instead of looking miserable all the time. Men don't want to date someone who looks angry." His friends laughed while he added that my resting bitch face was probably why I didn't get promoted. I turned to him with the biggest smile I'd ever produced and said he was absolutely right. Hudson looked proud of himself, not noticing how his friends' girlfriends were staring at him with disgust. I kept that smile plastered on my face for the rest of the party, grinning like a pageant contestant while Hudson told his gross stories. His friend's girlfriend pulled him aside and whispered that it looked like he'd threatened me or something because no one smiles that much unless they're scared. Hudson tried to explain he'd just asked me to smile more, which made him sound even worse, like he was controlling what expressions I was allowed to have. The next morning, I smiled through breakfast while Hudson criticized my cooking, my apartment, my career choices. His mother called to ask about the party since his friend's mom had mentioned something seemed off with me. Hudson handed me the phone, rolling his eyes, and I answered with the brightest voice possible. "Everything's wonderful." Hudson taught me that I need to smile more because men don't like angry women, so I'm smiling all the time now. She went silent before saying she was coming over immediately, and when she arrived, she took one look at my frozen smile and started yelling at Hudson about what he'd done to me. His mother insisted we come to his grandmother's funeral that weekend to show the family everything was fine, but that backfired spectacularly when I smiled through the entire service. I beamed in the front row while everyone cried, and his relatives were horrified. When they asked Hudson why I was smiling at a funeral, he had to admit he'd told me to smile more. His aunt said, "You made her smile at a funeral? What kind of controlling psychopath are you?" The entire family turned on him, saying he'd obviously broken me somehow, and his mother started crying about where she went wrong raising him. His brother still invited us to his wedding the next month, probably hoping things would improve, but I stood grinning maniacally in every photo while the bride was having a breakdown about her missing flowers. The photographer kept asking if I could look more sympathetic, and Hudson had to explain our situation in front of the entire wedding party. The bride's family spent the rest of the reception whispering about Hudson's abusive control tactics, and several of them cornered me in the bathroom to slip me domestic violence hotline numbers. Hudson thought a night out would help us look normal, but we ran into his ex-girlfriend at the bar, crying about her dad's cancer diagnosis. I stood there smiling brilliantly while she sobbed, and when someone asked what was wrong with me, I said loudly, "Hudson told me I need to smile more because men don't like angry women." The entire bar turned to look at Hudson like he was a monster, and his ex actually slapped him before several women came over to ask if I needed help getting away from him. The stress gave Hudson food poisoning that night, and he spent 3 hours throwing up while I smiled supportively next to the toilet. His roommate found us with me grinning while Hudson lay groaning on the floor and immediately asked what Hudson had done to me. He said I'd be prettier if I smiled more, I explained, still smiling. His roommate called Hudson an abusive piece of garbage and moved out that week, posting on social media about Hudson's psychological torture. Hudson's boss saw those posts and dragged him to a company dinner to assess the situation himself. I smiled relentlessly while his boss talked about serious topics like layoffs and budget cuts, never breaking my grin even when discussing workplace tragedies. His boss pulled Hudson aside and said, "Why are you making her smile like that?" Hudson's attempt to explain confirmed everything, and his boss started treating him like a potential HR nightmare who might snap at female employees. Between his boss's concerns, his family's horror, and his friends refusing to hang out with someone they thought was an abuser, Hudson was falling apart. His mother wouldn't speak to him. His therapist said his need to dictate my facial expressions was deeply concerning, and by Sunday he was begging me to stop smiling. "Everyone thinks I'm a controlling psychopath," he screamed while I smiled at him peacefully. "My entire life is destroyed." His phone rang with his father's name on the screen, and Hudson went pale because his dad only called when someone had called him first with concerns. As he answered, I heard his father's booming voice say something about an intervention. Hudson hung up and stared at me in horror. "What intervention? What did you do?" I kept smiling as I pulled out my phone and showed him the group text with his family, friends, and boss, all confirming they'd be here in an hour for his control issues intervention that I'd been organizing all week with a smile on my face. The doorbell rang exactly 58 minutes later, and Hudson froze like a deer caught in headlights while I walked to the door still wearing that same bright smile. His mother came in first, looking worn out and tired, followed by his father who had that stern look he always wore when someone disappointed him. His brother pushed past them both and immediately went to stand by the hallway leading to the bedrooms, probably making sure Hudson couldn't escape. The boss appeared on his mother's laptop screen, adjusting his webcam while more people filed in behind them. Hudson's aunt arrived with a notebook. His therapist called in on speakerphone that his mother set up on the coffee table, and even his ex-girlfriend joined via another video call on someone else's phone. The roommate who'd moved out showed up last, carrying printed screenshots in a folder, and everyone arranged themselves around our living room while I sat down in the center chair, hands folded in my lap, that frozen smile never leaving my face. Hudson backed into the corner by the window, looking from person to person like he was calculating escape routes, but his brother shifted position to block that exit too. His father cleared his throat and started speaking in that deep voice that made everyone pay attention, explaining this wasn't about attacking Hudson, but about addressing patterns that were destroying his life and hurting people around him. Hudson immediately tried to bolt for the door, but his brother grabbed his arm and guided him to the couch, saying they were doing this because they loved him, and wanted him to get help before things got worse. His mother pulled out her reading glasses and unfolded several pages of notes, her voice shaking as she read about watching me smile through her own mother's funeral service, how the entire family was disturbed and confused by what they'd witnessed. She started crying halfway through, saying she must have failed as a mother if her son thought it was acceptable to control what expressions women were allowed to have on their faces. The therapist's voice came through the speaker, professional but concerned, explaining that Hudson's behavior showed clear signs of coercive control and image obsession that stemmed from deep insecurity about how others perceived him. She recommended intensive therapy sessions, possibly residential treatment, and said his need to control my facial expressions was just the tip of a much larger problem with wanting to control how the world saw him through controlling others. Hudson's ex-girlfriend spoke up from the laptop screen, describing how he used to criticize her laugh for being too loud, her voice for being too high-pitched, even the way she walked, because he thought people might judge him for dating someone who walked with confidence instead of taking smaller steps. She said she'd spent years in therapy after their relationship ended, finally understanding that his constant criticism wasn't about helping her improve, but about his own deep fears of not being good enough. His boss leaned forward on the video screen, adjusting his tie while expressing serious concerns about Hudson's judgment and decision-making abilities in the workplace. He mentioned that HR had already started documenting concerns, that Hudson would be placed on a performance improvement plan immediately, and that mandatory workplace behavior training would be required if he wanted to keep his position. Everyone turned to look at me, waiting, and I slowly stood up with that same soft smile, pulling out my phone where I'd typed a prepared statement over the past week. My hands shook slightly, but my voice stayed steady as I read through the list of comments he'd made about my appearance, my expressions, my career, the public humiliations at parties and family events, the constant criticism disguised as helpful suggestions. I kept smiling the entire time, even when describing how he'd grabbed my face at his friend's party, how he'd told everyone my resting face was why I didn't get promoted, how he'd made me feel like existing in my natural state was somehow offensive to him. Hudson suddenly stood up, waving his hands around, trying to minimize everything by saying he just wanted me to be happier and more approachable, that people misunderstood his intentions, that everyone was blowing this way out of proportion. His aunt immediately shut him down, standing up from her chair and reminding him how he'd justified my funeral smiling to the entire extended family, how he'd actually told grieving relatives that he'd instructed me to smile more because men didn't like angry women. The roommate opened his folder and started passing around the screenshots of his social media posts about Hudson's psychological torture, posts that had been shared dozens of times, commented on by mutual friends, spreading through their entire social circle over the past week. Hudson went pale as he looked at the papers, seeing comment after comment from people calling him an abuser, sharing their own stories about controlling partners, warning others to stay away from him, and his hands started shaking as he realized how widely his behavior had been discussed and condemned. I sat back down in my chair, still smiling, watching Hudson finally face real consequences for his actions, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion wash over me. Part of me felt vindicated seeing his family and friends take this seriously, seeing them refuse to excuse his behavior or minimize what he'd done, but another part felt unexpectedly sad about what we'd become. Somewhere under all the anger and hurt, I could still remember the person I thought he was when we first met, before the criticism started, before the comments about my appearance became daily occurrences, before that moment at the party when everything changed. That night, after everyone left the intervention, I grabbed 2 suitcases from the closet and started throwing clothes into them, while Hudson sat on the bed watching me with his mouth hanging open. My hands moved fast, pulling shirts off hangers, emptying drawers, stuffing everything into the bags without folding anything properly. Hudson kept saying my name over and over, but I just kept packing, grabbing my toothbrush from the bathroom, my laptop from the desk, the phone charger from the nightstand. I wrote out a list on the back of an envelope, my hand steady even though my heart was pounding, listing every boundary he'd crossed and what it would take for me to even consider talking to him again. The list covered both sides of the envelope, and I left it on the kitchen counter next to his coffee mug, before wheeling my suitcases out the door. My coworker lived 20 minutes away, and had already texted that her couch was ready with fresh sheets and a spare key under the mat. She opened the door before I could knock, took one look at my face and pulled me inside without asking any questions. The apartment smelled like chamomile tea, and she had a mug ready on the coffee table, still steaming, next to a box of tissues and a fuzzy blanket. I sat on her couch and cried for the first time in weeks, real tears instead of that frozen smile, while she sat next to me rubbing my back and letting me get it all out. My phone started buzzing around midnight, and didn't stop until morning. 17 messages from Hudson that went from apologizing to angry to begging to accusing me of ruining his life on purpose. Each message got longer and more unhinged, first saying he was sorry for telling me to smile, then saying I'd overreacted, then saying the intervention was an ambush, then saying I was manipulative for turning everyone against him. I took screenshots of every single message, my fingers shaking as I scrolled through them, then forwarded the whole batch to the email address on the card my coworker had given me for the Women's Center downtown. The advocate replied within an hour, even though it was barely 7 in the morning, asking if I could come in that afternoon to discuss my options. Her office had soft lighting and plants everywhere, nothing like the harsh fluorescent lights I'd expected, and she handed me a cup of coffee before sitting across from me with a yellow legal pad. She walked me through creating a safety plan, asking about Hudson's access to my workplace, whether he had keys to anywhere I might go, if he knew my passwords or had access to my bank accounts. We went through each area of my life methodically, identifying risks and creating backup plans, changing passwords, updating emergency contacts, making sure someone always knew where I was. She explained the process for getting a protective order, the evidence I'd need, the court dates, the enforcement challenges, all while validating that what I'd experienced was real abuse, not just relationship problems like Hudson kept insisting. 2 days later, Hudson's mother called while I was eating breakfast at my coworker's kitchen table, her voice tired and apologetic on the other end. She told me the family had given Hudson an ultimatum after the intervention, either start weekly therapy sessions or lose access to the family money that helped pay his rent. She kept apologizing, saying she should have seen the signs earlier, that Hudson's father had the same controlling habits about her appearance when they were younger, always commenting on her weight, her clothes, her makeup. The irony hit me the next morning at work when my manager stopped by my desk and mentioned that I seemed different lately, more genuine, less forced in my interactions with customers. I actually laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from my chest, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks, and my manager smiled and said it was nice to see me happy. 3 days later, I was eating lunch at my desk when the receptionist called to say someone was here to see me, and I knew before she said his name that Hudson had shown up. Security met me in the lobby where Hudson was pacing near the entrance, his hair messy, wearing the same shirt from the intervention, insisting he just wanted 5 minutes to explain everything. I told security about the situation, showed them the screenshots on my phone, and watched as 2 guards escorted Hudson out while he kept yelling that I was being dramatic. My manager pulled me aside afterward and offered to adjust my schedule so I wouldn't be alone during arrival and departure times, even suggested I could work from home a few days a week if that would help. A week passed before Hudson's therapist reached out through his mother, requesting a joint session to address what she called the relationship dynamics that needed processing. I agreed to one session with clear conditions, that I could leave whenever I wanted, that Hudson couldn't approach me afterward, that the therapist would maintain professional boundaries throughout. The session was in a different building than I'd expected, more modern with big windows, and Hudson was already there when I arrived, sitting in a leather chair looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The therapist started by asking Hudson to explain his perspective on our relationship, and he launched into this whole story about just wanting me to be happier, more approachable, more pleasant to be around. She stopped him and asked him to dig deeper, to think about where those expectations came from, and after 20 minutes of deflection, Hudson finally admitted he'd watched his father do the same thing to his mother for years. His father would critique his mother's expressions, tell her to smile at his work events, criticize her for looking tired or stressed, control how she presented herself in public, and Hudson had absorbed it all as normal. The therapist helped him see the pattern, but made it clear that understanding where it came from didn't excuse the behavior or erase the harm he'd caused. When she asked me about my experience, I decided to be completely honest and told them both that my Smile campaign wasn't just malicious compliance, but a deliberately designed plan to destroy Hudson's reputation. Hudson's jaw dropped and he started to speak, but the therapist held up her hand and said my response, while extreme, was actually a form of resistance to abuse, a way of taking back power when I felt powerless. 2 days after the session, Hudson's brother called while I was making dinner at my coworker's place, his voice awkward and apologetic through the phone speaker. He said he felt terrible about the wedding situation, that his wife had been mortified when she understood what was happening, that the photographer had actually managed to edit some of the photos to look more natural using some software. His wife wanted to meet me separately for coffee, to offer support, to let me know they didn't blame me for what happened at their wedding, that they understood I was surviving a bad situation the only way I knew how. 3 days later, Hudson's brother's wife texted asking if we could meet at the coffee shop near the mall. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a folder on the table and 2 coffees waiting. She pushed one toward me and opened the folder to show printed emails and text messages going back years. Her hands shook as she spread the papers out, showing Hudson's dad telling his mom to wear different clothes, to speak softer at parties, to stop embarrassing him with her opinions. One email from 5 years ago showed him threatening to cancel her credit cards if she didn't lose weight before his company Christmas party. She'd been collecting evidence since she married into the family, watching the same patterns repeat with Hudson, and now with me. We sat there for 2 hours going through everything while she explained how Hudson's mom would defend her husband, make excuses, pretend it was normal. She wanted to stage an intervention for the parents too, but needed more people to see the problem first. That same week, Hudson got called into HR at his job, where they handed him enrollment papers for a mandatory 6-week behavior modification program. His boss was there too, arms crossed, explaining that the social media posts and dinner incident had raised serious concerns about his judgment and treatment of women. The program met 3 times a week after work, and missing even one session would result in immediate termination. Hudson had to sign an agreement acknowledging this was his final chance, and any similar incident would end his employment permanently. His boss made it clear this wasn't negotiable, and the company was already documenting everything for potential legal protection. Meanwhile, Hudson's roommate started packing his stuff early, loading boxes into his car every evening after work. When Hudson asked why he was leaving before the lease ended, his roommate just shook his head and said he couldn't live with someone who psychologically tortures their partner. The stress of finding a new roommate on top of everything else had Hudson calling rental agencies at all hours, desperate to find someone to split costs. Nobody wanted to move in after seeing his social media reputation, though. The Women's Center had recommended a support group that met Tuesday evenings in a church basement downtown. I went to my first meeting expecting maybe 5 or 6 people, but found 30 women sitting in a circle. When I shared my smile story, heads nodded around the room and hands went up with similar experiences. One woman's ex made her wear makeup to bed, another's husband monitored her facial expressions during sex, a third had to practice smiling in the mirror before family events. The leader explained this type of appearance control was more common than people realized, and often escalated to physical violence. After 3 sessions, I understood my experience wasn't unique or even unusual. Hudson's mom started seeing her own therapist after recognizing how she'd normalized her husband's behavior for decades. She sent me a 4-page handwritten letter apologizing for raising Hudson in an environment where controlling women's appearance was considered normal. She wrote about realizing she'd been making excuses for both her husband and son, teaching Hudson that women should modify themselves to keep men happy. The letter arrived with a book about breaking generational patterns of emotional abuse that she'd highlighted and annotated. 3 weeks after the intervention, Hudson asked to meet at the public park near the lake to talk about our relationship. He'd completed several therapy sessions by then and seemed different, calmer, but also confused. We sat on opposite ends of a bench while he explained his therapist was helping him understand his behavior, but he still didn't really get why everyone was so upset. He kept saying things like he just wanted me to be happy, and couldn't understand why that was wrong. The fact that he still couldn't see the difference between wanting someone's happiness and controlling their expression told me everything I needed to know. I told him our relationship was over permanently, but hoped he'd continue therapy for his own growth. Hudson started crying right there on the bench, saying he'd lost everything because of one stupid comment about smiling. I reminded him it wasn't one comment, but years of criticism and control, and these weren't punishments, but natural consequences of his choices. He begged for another chance, but I was already standing up to leave. My coworker found me a studio apartment I could actually afford on my own in a building her cousin managed. She helped me move my stuff from storage while Hudson was at his behavior modification class. The apartment was small but mine, with windows facing a tree-lined street and neighbors who minded their own business. Setting up my own space without anyone criticizing my decorating choices or telling me how to arrange furniture felt like breathing freely after years underwater. Hudson's dad called my new number that I'd only given to select people, somehow getting it from someone, his voice angry and demanding. He said I'd destroyed his family with my dramatic overreaction to a simple request, that I'd turned everyone against them for no reason. I stayed calm and told him his son learned these behaviors somewhere, that maybe he should look in a mirror before blaming me. The line went silent before he started yelling about ungrateful women not knowing their place. I hung up and blocked his number immediately. The support group leader pulled me aside after a meeting to ask if I'd share my story at their community awareness event next month. She thought my smile protest was creative resistance that might help others recognize emotional abuse disguised as helpful suggestions. I agreed, realizing my weird campaign might actually serve a purpose beyond just destroying Hudson's reputation. 2 months passed before I heard through mutual friends that Hudson was dating someone new, this girl from his gym who seemed nice enough and had no idea about our history. Our friend group was split about whether to warn her, with some saying it wasn't their business while others felt guilty watching her walk into the same trap I'd escaped. She posted photos of them together on social media, Hudson's arm around her waist while she smiled naturally, not the forced grin he'd demanded from me. 3 weeks into their relationship, she messaged me out of nowhere asking if we could meet for coffee because Hudson had started criticizing her workout clothes, saying they made her look desperate for attention. We met at a quiet cafe downtown where she sat across from me nervously stirring her latte while I explained the pattern without telling her what to do, just laying out the facts of what happened with me. Her face went pale when I described the smile campaign and how it destroyed his reputation. Then she asked if I thought he'd changed since therapy. I pulled out the Women's Center pamphlet I'd been carrying and slid it across the table, telling her to keep it just in case things got worse. She thanked me and left quickly, and I found out later she broke up with Hudson that same week. Hudson's mother called me occasionally with updates about his therapy progress, saying it was slow but real according to what his therapist shared during family sessions. She explained he was starting to understand how his anxiety about other people's perceptions had driven his need to control my appearance, though he still struggled to take full accountability for the harm he'd caused. The therapist apparently spent entire sessions just getting Hudson to recognize that wanting me to smile wasn't about my happiness, but about his image, something that seemed obvious to everyone else but remained a revelation to him. Meanwhile, the Women's Center had organized a community awareness event where they asked me to share my story with a larger audience. I stood at the podium in front of almost 200 people, telling them about the party where it all started, the funeral smile, the wedding photos, and the intervention that finally ended things. More people than I expected approached me afterward, including several men who asked if their own behavior might be controlling, showing more self-awareness in those few minutes than Hudson had shown in our entire relationship. One man specifically asked if telling his wife to dress more conservatively was similar, and when I explained how it was about control rather than concern, he looked genuinely troubled and said he needed to apologize to her. Hudson's employer made him present at a company-wide training about respectful workplace behavior as part of his improvement plan following the intervention. His mother told me his coworkers now viewed him completely differently, avoiding him at lunch and excluding him from after-work gatherings, because they'd all heard about the smile thing through office gossip. The isolation was apparently one of the hardest consequences for Hudson to handle, since he'd always prided himself on being well-liked at work. Around this time, I started dating someone new, a guy from my book club who noticed when I forced a smile during a discussion about a sad novel and gently asked if I was okay. The simple respect for my authentic emotions felt revolutionary after what I'd experienced with Hudson, and when I explained my history, He just listened without trying to fix anything or defend Hudson or suggest I should forgive and forget. He never once told me how I should feel or what expression I should wear, just accepted whatever mood I brought to our dates. Hudson's parents were having their own crisis according to his brother, with his mother threatening separation after recognizing how his father's controlling behavior had created the blueprint for Hudson's actions. His father initially refused counseling, insisting there was nothing wrong with wanting his wife to look presentable, but when she actually packed her bags and moved in with her sister, he suddenly agreed to marriage counseling. The counselor apparently told them both that their dynamic had taught Hudson that love meant controlling someone's appearance for your own comfort. 6 months after our breakup, Hudson sent me an email with a genuine apology letter that his therapist had helped him write as part of his treatment. He acknowledged the harm he'd caused without asking for forgiveness or expecting a response, writing that he understood now how his behavior was abusive and that my smile protest, while humiliating for him, was a creative form of resistance to his control. The letter showed real progress even if it couldn't undo the damage, and I saved it as proof that people could change if they actually did the work. The Women's Center director approached me about becoming a peer counselor for others experiencing emotional abuse, saying my story and approach resonated with many survivors who felt empowered by the idea of creative resistance. I accepted immediately, wanting to help people recognize these patterns before they escalated into years of subtle control and criticism, disguised as helpful suggestions. My first counseling session was with a young woman whose boyfriend constantly criticized her laugh, telling her it was too loud and embarrassing in public, and I saw myself in her exhausted eyes. Hudson's brother and sister-in-law invited me to dinner at their place to maintain our friendship despite all the family drama. Over pasta and wine, they shared that Hudson was living alone now in a studio apartment across town, focusing entirely on therapy and work without dating anyone new. His brother mentioned Hudson had asked about me but respected that I didn't want contact beyond the single apology letter, which showed more boundaries than he'd ever displayed during our relationship. 3 months later, my new boyfriend asked if I wanted to meet his parents for Sunday dinner, and I said yes without thinking twice about what face I should wear. We drove to their house in the suburbs where his mom opened the door and immediately pulled me into a hug while his dad shook my hand and asked about my work. During dinner, I laughed at his dad's bad jokes and frowned when his mom talked about their neighbor's health problems, and nobody once commented on my expressions or told me how I should look. His mom pulled me aside while we were doing dishes and said she hadn't seen her son this happy in years, and that I seemed so much more relaxed than when she'd seen photos from before. I realized she meant the photos from Hudson's brother's wedding where I was smiling like a robot, and she touched my arm gently saying she was glad I got away from that situation. My own mother visited the next week and kept staring at me during lunch until I finally asked what was wrong. She admitted she'd been worried about Hudson for over a year, but didn't know how to bring it up without sounding like an interfering parent, and she'd noticed how tired I always looked around him. She said watching me now was like seeing her daughter come back to life after being gone for so long. Meanwhile, Hudson was finishing his workplace behavior program, according to a mutual friend who still worked at his company. His boss kept him at arm's length now and made sure he wasn't put on any projects with female team members, which basically killed his chances for promotion. The friend said Hudson completed all 6 weeks of training and passed the final assessment, but everyone in the office knew why he'd been sent there and treated him differently. 8 months after our breakup, I was picking out tomatoes at the grocery store when I heard someone say my name and turned to see Hudson holding a basket of frozen dinners. We stood there for a moment before he asked how I was doing, and I said I was good without elaborating. He looked older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes and his clothes wrinkled like he wasn't taking care of himself. He started to say something about my appearance, then stopped himself mid-sentence and just said it was nice to see me before walking away quickly toward the checkout. I watched him leave and noticed he didn't look back or make any comments about how I should smile more or look happier to see him. The support group I'd been attending for a year threw me a small party with cake and balloons to celebrate my anniversary of leaving the relationship. Several members stood up to share how my story about the Smile campaign had helped them recognize the control in their own relationships and find the courage to leave. One woman said she'd been with someone who criticized her weight constantly, and my story made her realize she didn't have to accept that treatment. Another person shared that their ex used to police their friendships, and hearing about my experience helped them see that wasn't normal or okay. During the holidays, Hudson's mother sent me a card with a long handwritten note thanking me for inadvertently saving her marriage. She wrote that watching what happened between Hudson and me forced her to look at her own relationship and realized she'd been accepting the same controlling behavior from Hudson's father for 30 years. They were still in counseling twice a week and making real progress on their communication patterns, though it was hard work breaking habits that old. She said Hudson's father was learning to express his feelings without criticizing her appearance or behavior, and she was learning to set boundaries after decades of just going along with whatever he wanted. My new relationship had its own challenges, like when we disagreed about money or chores or weekend plans, but we worked through them by talking like adults. When I got upset about something, he'd ask what was wrong instead of telling me to smile, and when he was stressed about work, I didn't have to perform happiness to make him feel better. We had a big fight about his ex texting him late at night, but we resolved it through actual communication, instead of him telling me I was being too emotional, or that I'd be prettier if I wasn't angry. Hudson sent me an email almost 2 years after our breakup, saying he was moving to another city for a fresh start with a new job. He thanked me for forcing him to confront his issues, even though the way it happened was humiliating, and had basically destroyed his social life in our city. He said his therapist helped him understand that the public shame was a natural consequence of his behavior, and that starting over somewhere else might help him practice what he'd learned without everyone knowing his history. I wrote a blog post about using weaponized compliance against emotional abuse that got picked up by several websites and shared thousands of times. The comments filled with stories from people who'd done similar things, like one woman who started crying constantly after her husband said she was too emotional. Another person wrote about agreeing enthusiastically with every criticism until their partner realized how cruel they sounded, hearing their own words repeated back. On my 1-year anniversary with my new partner, we went to a comedy show where we both laughed until our stomachs hurt without anyone monitoring our reactions. During intermission, he made a silly face at me and I made one back, and we sat there being ridiculous together like actual partners instead of performer and critic. The freedom to just feel whatever I felt without calculating its impact on someone else's ego still amazed me every single day. Hudson's family held their annual reunion that summer, and his mother called to tell me about the positive changes in everyone's dynamics since the intervention. Hudson attended with appropriate boundaries and didn't comment on anyone's appearance or tell any woman there how they should act or feel to be more attractive. His father was still working on not giving unsolicited advice about how people should present themselves, and his mother was standing up for herself when he slipped back into old patterns. The Women's Center called me that fall asking if I could attend their annual fundraising dinner because they wanted to recognize my volunteer work. I'd been helping other women spot the warning signs of emotional control for over a year by then, running support groups twice a week and meeting one-on-one with people who reached out after reading my blog posts. The dinner was at a fancy hotel downtown, and I wore a simple black dress, sitting at a table with other volunteers while the director gave speeches about the center's impact. When she called my name for Volunteer of the Year, I walked to the stage feeling weird about getting an award for something that started as petty revenge. She handed me a plaque and told the audience how my story had reached thousands of women online and helped dozens locally recognize controlling relationships before they got worse. I stood there holding the plaque while people clapped, thinking about how Hudson's demand that I smile more had accidentally created something useful. After the dinner, 3 different women came up to tell me their own stories about partners who controlled their appearance or expressions, and one said my blog helped her leave after 5 years. My phone buzzed the next week with a Facebook message from someone I didn't recognize, but when I opened it, the name hit me like cold water. Hudson's new girlfriend was reaching out to thank me for the warning I'd given her 8 months earlier when she'd first started dating him. She wrote that she'd ignored my advice at first, thinking I was just a bitter ex, but after 3 months the patterns started showing up exactly like I'd described. He'd criticized her makeup, told her she laughed too loud, suggested she'd look better if she lost weight, all the small comments that seemed caring but were really about control. She'd remembered our conversation and started documenting everything, then showed it to her therapist who confirmed the red flags. She left him after he grabbed her wrist at a party to stop her from talking to a male friend, recognizing the escalation pattern I'd warned her about. She was in therapy now working through why she'd been drawn to someone like that, and wanted me to know my warning probably saved her years of damage. 2 years had passed since that awful party where Hudson grabbed my face and my life looked nothing like it had then. I was taking night classes toward a degree while still working full-time, living alone in a small apartment I decorated exactly how I wanted without anyone's criticism. My group of friends included people from the support groups, from work, from the school, all of them accepting me whether I was laughing, crying, tired, or just existing with whatever expression my face naturally made. Hudson had moved to another state according to his mother's occasional updates, still in therapy and apparently making real progress understanding the family patterns he'd inherited. My smile showed up when something made me happy, disappeared when I was concentrating or tired, and nobody commented on it either way, because that's how normal relationships work. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me today. All the questioning, all the wondering, it's been so meaningful to explore these moments with you. Until we meet again, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.